age is the age of the moving picture. Stop the camera, and for a moment, we stop history. As the 20th century opened, newsreels were placing on record a portrait of their times. They saw it in terms of power, clothed in fine uniforms and gold braid, an age of scepters and crowns and proud horses, stepping forth to martial music. Most of the ruling houses of Europe were related to each other. The sovereigns of Britain and Germany were first cousins. To see them sitting side by side, you would think that the old order would last forever. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died in the 64th year of her reign, the longest in British history. The Queen was 81. Potentates of all colors and creeds respected her as their head. Many of them counted themselves members of her family. The German Kaiser was a grandson, the wife of the Russian Tsar a granddaughter. The queens of Norway, Sweden, Spain, Greece, and Romania were all granddaughters. Kings and princes, dukes and archdukes, all the nobility of Europe, it seemed, gathered in London to honor her memory. In Washington, flags were lowered, a mark of respect never before paid on the death of a monarch. The New York Times, then selling for 1 cent, described her passing as the greatest event in the memory of this generation. To understand this event, 3 of today's correspondents of the paper imagine reporting on the scene.
Well, had I been a young reporter standing on the pavement, watching that procession, all the crowned heads of Europe following behind the coffin of Queen Victoria, I would have felt that there was nothing that could challenge this edifice of power and splendor that was represented by that group. Of course, I might have known that there were people who were devoted to its downfall. Jean Jaurès in France, Webel in Germany, Keir Hardie and MacDonald in England. But none of those people would seem strong enough to break the hold that these great dynasties had on the Europe of that time. You might indeed hear beyond the bands the movement of peoples, of armies, of navies getting ready for Armageddon. But you would have to be a very perceptive man to realize that this was coming within 15 years. Had I been a correspondent for an American newspaper in London in January 1901, the time of Queen Victoria's funeral, I perhaps would have written nothing about the politics of the occasion, whatever they might have been. I would have been very much impressed by the pomp. I would have equated pomp with power, and I would have considered and would have so said that the world is in very good hands.
world looked solid and stable, still dominated by Victoria, even though she herself was dead. British military power ruled the world. There were clouds on the horizon, of course. Russia, which since the middle of the 19th century had begun to challenge England, looked as though it might eventually be a source of war. Germany beginning to build up under the Kaiser, but still not a serious challenge. In Asia, very little. China, a broken empire, really a plaything of the Western powers. Japan, untested, raw, possibly a potential menace in the Pacific, but no one could know that at the time of Victoria's death.
The Victorian age had made London the center of the world. Here was concentrated the power of a great empire, the greatest in history. Nothing, it seemed, could disturb the tranquility of the British way of life. The steady evolution of her constitution through the centuries had given Britain a stability which was the envy of the world. There were ripples on the surface of things, the campaign to give women the vote, for instance. In the years which followed Victoria's death, suffragettes set out to catch the eye of the public, harbingers of all similar media events in our own day. The camera happened to catch one dramatic scene. At the Derby in 1913, a suffragette tried to bring down the King's horse. She later died from the injuries she received, and her funeral was the occasion for another appeal to public emotion. In the old order of things, the British ruled an empire on which they liked to boast the sun never set. India was regarded as the brightest jewel in the imperial crown. To emphasize the power of his empire, King George V came to India in 1911 to attend a colossal durbar at Delhi. The monarchy played an important part in providing a focus of loyalty in this empire. Though the real power lay in Parliament in London, its outward appearance was symbolized by the crown. As the Rajas and princes paid homage to their king emperor, the old order looked solid enough. Among these native rulers were some of the richest men in the world. But no one here would dare challenge the imperial might of Britain, nor had they any interest in doing so. Britain thought to impart to her subject peoples her own virtues of justice and order. And under the old order, they were probably better governed than they had ever been. In China, Britain maintained an imperial presence at the expense of the tottering Manchu dynasty. In addition to her colonies, which she ruled directly from London, Britain kept order in the great commercial centers of China. In 1911, a nationalist revolution broke out, which would eventually lead to turning this most ancient of civilizations upside down. Humiliating though it was to the Chinese to have to tolerate the presumption of these white-skinned barbarians, no one at the time could see how their power could be contested. Such was the Pax Britannica, a British peace in which the Royal Navy acted as policemen. Since Nelson's victory in the Battle of Trafalgar, Britain ruled the waves. Her navy was the most powerful afloat, more powerful than the combined fleets of her two nearest rivals. Across the North Sea from Britain, Germany had grown to be among the most powerful nations in the world. United by Bismarck into an empire, the Germans were able to enjoy their traditional pursuits in security and contentment. Berlin rivaled Paris in the sparkle of its fashion and variety of its entertainment. German technology was as advanced as any in the world. On the surface, at least, the old order held the promise of even better things to come. Prussian military expertise had given the King of Prussia leadership over all other German states except Austria. William II, who became Kaiser in 1888, loved uniforms and parade. Kaiser William's court was the most brilliant in Europe. Under wise leadership, Germany, with the strongest land force in the world, could have secured the old order for a century and more. Germany's strength came from her growing industrial power, which by 1900 had exceeded Britain's. Her population was also growing rapidly, and her workers, while enjoying more advanced welfare schemes than existed in most other countries, were demanding greater political rights. The Camera never made much of this. In the old order, power was seen to belong to the few at the top, rather than to the masses. And in Germany, the few at the top did not think twice about using force to suppress workers if necessary. There was an escape from poverty and injustice to America, land of opportunity, land of the free. From all over Europe, they came in a never-ending stream, an average of nearly 1 million a year during the first 10 years of the century. In 30 years, America's population doubled. Many of the men and women who poured ashore in the early years of the 20th century would find the going tough. 25 years later, the ones who hadn't made it would be out of work and begging for a dime, mister. They'd be ready to vote for a New Deal every time. America had its own order of things. On New York Stock Exchange, many an obscure man rose to fame and fortune. America's industrialization was spectacular. By 1914, she led the world in manufacturing production. In America, as in Europe, parades made good pictures. You could mount as good a show for president as you could for a king. In 1900, most Americans lived in the countryside. 20 years later, most of them lived in towns. Politicians took notice of the change their votes depended on. In 1904, Theodore Roosevelt, progressive Republican and advocate of the strenuous life, offered the people a square deal and was returned to the White House. Among his many admirers was a distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose first taste of power came in 1910, when he entered the New York State Senate as a Democrat. Democracy looked safe enough in America as long as the old order existed in Europe. The 20th century opened on a Europe which had enjoyed a generation of peace. The last major conflict had been the Franco-Prussian War, which ended in 1871 with France's humiliation. Since then, French diplomacy was aimed at finding allies in order to take her revenge one day on Germany. France first came to an understanding with Britain, an entente cordiale it was called. Helped along by state visits, the entente cordiale grew stronger as the danger of war increased. France's other ally was Russia, lying on the far side of Germany. An unlikely liaison for a republic to form, since Tsar Nicholas II was the most autocratic of all the European monarchs. No other order was conceivable in Russia. Terrorists and revolutionaries were known to be at large, but the camera saw only the outward show of power. Europe's peace was an armed peace. The annual maneuvers of the German army warned other armies to watch out. Ex-President Theodore Roosevelt came to look at them one day. So did the young Winston Churchill. He drew his own conclusions. Bismarck had once said, the great questions of the day are not decided by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. In the eyes of many Germans, might made right. In this kind of order, the armorers thrived. The German Kaiser was volatile, ambitious, and sensitive to the achievements of others. Why should his navy not be as great as Britain's? What folly this was. Britain and Germany had no serious quarrel with each other. On the contrary, they had a great deal in common. The Kaiser was a regular visitor to Britain, where the court welcomed him as one of the family. Yet he seemed unable to control his own restless nature. His diplomacy was impulsive and unproductive. His public gestures all too often gave offense. A ramshackle Turkish empire belonged to the old order. Sprawling across the Middle East, where oil is now king, it controlled the entrance to the Black Sea. To make friends with the Turk was another way the Kaiser could score over others. Finally, there was Austria, another victim of Bismarck's wars, but won over by him into an alliance with Germany, which gave a kind of solidity to Central Europe. In Vienna, the old order was represented by the aged Franz Joseph I, but Austria suffered from a chronic inability to control the many different nationalities in her fast diminishing empire. In truth, the old order concealed anarchy, international anarchy. The Hohenzollerns, the Romanovs, the Habsburgs were stepping towards an abyss. In June 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Franz Joseph's heir. It was the spark which set fire to the world. Why the world should tear itself to pieces over a quarrel in the Balkans is a matter for historians. But the result was to change the shape of the 20th century.
Neither the armies nor their generals believed they were marching to Armageddon. The general view on both sides is the war would be over by Christmas. And the people were far more enthusiastic then than they were a generation later. They shouted Nach Paris in Berlin, they shouted à Berlin in Paris. Everyone thought it would be a short and easy war. It was not. It was the end of the old order, as Europe had known it since Waterloo. And out of that end, out of the chaos, out of the fury, came the three men who probably had as much to do with shaping Europe in the Second World War as any. Hitler, a volunteer for a Bavarian regiment. Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty. And de Gaulle, a young, enthusiastic officer, probably having his sword sharpened at the regimental depot.
War kept the newsreels busy with new images of power. Cruder maybe than the plumed hats of courtiers, but good pictures all the same.
World War I destroyed the world as it was known in the 19th century. It came to an end in 1914, and it was never to rise again. It seemed in 1918 that the British Empire was intact, that France had won. But behind that facade, great changes had occurred. Russia was in chaos, but out of that chaos was going to arise a Stalin who would shake the world. China, a wreck, dominated by imperial powers. But in that wreckage, there would come to birth and to power a Mao Zedong and a Communist Party, which would be a power the world would have to reckon with.
Finally, war fever caught up with America, the justification to make the world safe for democracy.
The First World War destroyed the old order in Europe, but it left a ferment, it left an unsettled condition all over the landscape, which made it inevitable that the Second World War would come. And America reassessed itself, its action, and came to the conclusion it made a horrible mistake in getting into this First World War. And that was accompanied by, or followed by, a determination never to get into another foreign war, which made it very difficult for Franklin Roosevelt to lead the American people in a participation in Europe in 1940.
The old order passed, setting the stage for a new drama and new actors.